a quick story. I was introduced to Eric through another person who was involved with the Laguna Hills, what's that called? The Molten Ranch, Molten Museum, thank you. And Eric was a professor at Laguna College of Art and Design. I wanted to connect in there for the club. We got connected. We subsequently met in a Starbucks, talked for like an hour. I don't know how long it was. It was really enjoyable. And Eric is a Renaissance man. He's a great musician. He does fine art. He's a professional photographer. He's a professor. I don't know what else he doesn't do, but anyway, he does a lot. So in the Starbucks, we were talking about creativity, which is the subject of his talk today. And I said, okay, so we're sitting here. Take a picture, show me. He took the most amazing picture with his phone, of course. And I mean, it's impressive. And you've made a difference in my shooting, hopefully for the better, but at least different. I'll put it that way. So without further ado, Eric Stoner.
Well, thank you all for having me, and thanks to Bob. This is really an honor. I've been shooting professionally for 22 years now, and I've never spoken publicly about my work, strangely enough. I just kind of quietly just go along and do it. I think probably because I fell into it almost accidentally. It wasn't really a plan. I had been taking pictures, gosh, probably my whole life. So I'll kind of get into it. I know I have an hour, and I was a little overwhelmed by this because I thought, well, I got an hour to do what I would probably explain over a semester to a group of students. So it's like, I'm going to really crank through these slides. So anyways, I'm not going to get too much into the details. I just thought I'd put a funny self-portrait up from one of my clients' places here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about background because the talk is about creativity. And I think my earliest beginnings were, one, my father was a photographer, more of an enthusiast. He did some professional wedding and portrait work. He was an engineer, but he handed me a camera when I was in the 6th grade. I might not read this word for word, and I may go off script a little bit here because that seems to be more my style. But I think my early beginnings were because my dad was an outdoor enthusiast. And I spent a lot of time growing up in Utah, or multiple trips to Utah, because that's where my family was from. So my dad being an outdoor enthusiast, from the time I was a toddler, I was on his shoulders going to look at Double Arch and Arches National Park, or Zion, or Canyonlands, or Kodachrome Basin. And I think I absorbed that visual beauty into my DNA at a very early age, and it became something that I will say from the beginning of this talk, nature has been my greatest teacher, direct observation of nature. And as I grew, I think that vision just developed. I think it's what I credit for developing my creativity, was developing an aesthetic sense of just appreciating nature from the microcosm to the macrocosm. And I will say that because you'll see how it permeates almost every aspect of my work, except for a few shots that come in this slideshow. So landscapes and natural beauty form my aesthetics. And I kind of posed a question up there: are we forming a general aesthetic before we even start taking pictures, just by what we appreciate in our lives and in our everyday and our beauty? And I think that's an interesting question. I guess it's rhetorical. You have to answer that yourself. I don't really know the answer to it. So these were the experiences that formed me early on. I'm just throwing a few random photos from Utah that I've shot over the years. Some of these go back 20 years. Some of them were from the last trip I took, which was, what month is this, November? I think I was out there in the spring last, so we didn't get out there this summer yet. But I'm going to be there for a week and a half again in November. So let's go look at a few pictures here. Let's move along. So as I was developing as a photographer, as Bob said, I've been playing the guitar for 43 years. I developed as a musician. I was inclined towards the arts as a kid, and all through my adult life. So all those things that have formed my creativity, because for better or for worse, I think I always say I was born with one right hemisphere in my head, one giant one, which is all the creativity part of my brain, and the left has suffered, and I guess it gets by well enough. But as a child, my imagination went haywire, was constantly looking at things and analyzing things and breaking down shapes and colors and patterns and sounds. And I never really know. I've never been diagnosed or whatever, but I believe there's a condition called synesthesia that people have, where they see pictures when they hear music, and they hear music when they see pictures, and that's been something that's been acute in my whole life. So maybe I was just born with more of a creative mind to be able to process this information that came to me, but I think probably because I developed as a visual artist, a musician, and a photographer early on, doing darkroom photography in high school. And I started probably the most influential trips as an independent, growing out and growing away from home and my parents and whatnot, were just starting to take multiple road trips to Utah as a teenager and as a late teenager and into the 1990s. Chasing the light, like our other guest photographer was talking about. So I was initially drawn to the epic monuments and the hero shots, but I soon began really seeing the beauty off the beaten path. It wasn't necessarily lining up to see Delicate Arch in the morning, or to see the Sentinel at sunset, or to see things like that. I just sometimes found the most interesting photos were underneath my feet in the pattern of the rocks, because everywhere I went, I absorbed everything all around me under my feet, from the smallest of significance to the largest of significance. And that's where I started abstracting nature, is what I started doing, because nature is sort of perfect in its abstraction. And I think that was really something that informed my creativity. My formal art education at the Laguna College of Art and Design, I was exposed to a lot of abstract art of the 20th century. That's just a little Franz Klein painting over there on the right. And even with those things, when I would see them, I would see patterns in nature. Unfortunately, I wish I had some pictures of the paintings I did towards the end of my 4 years in college, because I just did formulated abstraction of things that reminded me of the rocks and the cliffs I saw out in Utah and whatnot. So similar to Franz Klein, maybe a little more textured, like you see the photograph on the right there, which was just a rock formation in a place right on the Utah-Arizona border, Arizona Strip, called the Wave, which is very difficult to get near because hundreds of people line up for permits for that. I've been out there when there was nobody there and there were no permits, and those are the good old days. But it's very difficult. As you know, if you're out in nature and anywhere near anything, it's kind of hard to get out to some of these places at some point because of the restrictions. But so the art, as I developed more as an artist, I'm still actively as a photographer, even though that wasn't really a focus in my college years. But so these trips were very essential to opening my eyes to seeing the world in the abstract, turning my eye into the relationship between shapes, colors, and darks and lights. So while I might not be taking a picture of Angel's Landing, probably one of the signature spots in Zion, I am noticing these things constantly because I constantly look around. So I'm very much about relationships between darks and lights, between objects, despite what their significance or insignificance may be. And a lot of where I believe my creativity has come from is just being acutely aware of what is going on around me. I get into a little list of points here, but one of those points I'll jump ahead and say is I think I've just developed a photographic mind even without a camera. So there's funny moments, even when I was talking to Bob when we met at Starbucks, I said it's just so ingrained in me to want to see the most beautiful picture everywhere I'm at. Even right here, in my mind, this track that's composing a picture in my mind. Whether or not I ever take it, I'm not, but in my mind, I'm registering that information. But I've noticed myself, even when I'm sitting in conversation with somebody, I'll adjust my seating position to make them look like a better portrait to me. I'm like, I don't like that tension merger in the windowsill, so I'm just gonna sit just a little over this way. I'm gonna lean back in my chair because I'm always framing something in my mind. And I think that's something just to sort of activate where you go. Ask yourself, you're at the gas station, what is the most interesting picture that I could take in this spot? What is the most interesting picture that could come out of this? And then in that, I'm taking stock of light all around me. I'm looking at everything. And like I said, I may not be taking a picture, but I'm certainly paying attention to what that picture would be. I'm just going to run through my favorite landscapes I've shot over the years from some of the most memorable spots. I love putting always a little bit of contextual perspective in there from the side of a cliff to sort of suggest height and whatnot. These are some of the areas of the slot canyons in Arizona and Utah that I've ventured into many times. Clearly, my dad exposed me to Ansel Adams at a very early age. He was a big landscape photographer. I say these are types of moments I live for, when clouds shift around and put one rock formation in shadow and light another one up. One of my very favorite things to bring into a photo, and it's sort of almost like a checklist, is I always like to find a point of simultaneous contrast where the brightest white is next to the darkest dark, even if it's a pinpoint. So there's a little I'm going to see if your the thing works here. He said that there was a oh, I got to hold it. There it is. There's my simultaneous contrast point right there. And I even get a bonus one up there on the left on that other rock formation. So those are really interesting things to look at no matter what you're looking at. Like I said, I'm going to get into this list, but I kind of want to run through some things. And another thing too that I like to call these roadside attractions occasionally, because sometimes the best landscape photo is not necessarily someplace you have to hike miles and miles away to do. Sometimes they just happen right off the side of the road. This is at the Bristlecone Pine Forest up in the White Mountains adjacent to the Eastern Sierras. So to look across to 14,000-foot peaks and have a glimpse like that through some rolling clouds and have one ray of sunlight and my simultaneous contrast, there it is over there on the left, the snow thing. These are always fun moments to capture. And again, not necessarily the point. These are some other interesting areas out in the Nevada desert. I love movement. I love the dynamics that you can find just through in nature. And so we take a quick jump to some live music. So after I graduated from college, I moved to Washington. I was no longer in proximity of being 5 or 6 hours away from the desert where I love to go photograph. So, and for whatever reason, I think maybe because I became somewhat depressed when I got in the rain, I didn't realize I was a person that could not function well in 300 days of rain a year. Like, what is this horrible leaden anvil that's around my neck? I wanted nothing to do with being outside in the rain and the trees. So as a musician, I dove back into music after what I did. I started getting involved in the local music scene. I started photographing a lot of musicians, and to this day, I still love photographing musicians. In fact, if I have time, I might even be going to do that tonight later on, depending if I fill up for it tonight, because I'm shooting a local band that I love a lot. But and I think what music did, not only had I absorbed all this information from nature, but I started just sort of throwing myself into extremely dynamic, fast-moving environments, moving lights, just places you had to think really quickly and be on your feet. But at the same time, I think how nature had informed me, I had just sort of applied everything to nature. I tend to look at the world in landscapes. I tend to look at the world very abstractly. So when I'm looking at a scene, I'm focused on my subject, but I'm focused on more what's going on around my subject as to how it's being framed or how it's relating to something else. So then, strangely enough, I've fallen into some interesting things, because this is all pre-career, so I haven't really developed a career yet. I think I was selling art supplies at Daniel Smith or something like that when I moved to Washington. I fell into a job as a kindergarten teacher, of all things, at an alternative education school called the Waldorf School. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, but it's a very more holistic, natural-based, creativity-based school. And I had gone to an event, and I had taken a few pictures of the children, and I had one place I did work in the 90s, I was a Fuji lab technician, so I worked at a high-volume Fuji color lab, and I saw nothing but thousands and thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of photos of kids, adorable kids, just kind of grimacing at the camera. And I always noticed that whenever you have a kid and you take their picture, they all of a sudden get in picture mode and they want their picture taken. They're being goofy, and it's always adorable, but I just because I wanted to do something different, and I was able to observe these children every day being their teacher, I'm like, I'm going to take candids of these kids and see how it goes. And some of the parents were literally in tears when I started giving these to them, because they showed their children in such a natural light when they didn't know their picture was taken, that they were even saying they felt like they were seeing what they were going to look like when they grew up. They were seeing pictures of their kids as teenagers, and it was working in this school for 3 years that I really developed an editorial style. I still was not a professional, but I was just somebody who loved taking pictures. I loved making people happy with the images that I shot for them, especially to have an opportunity to have access to photographing children like this was just so rare, and their families and the teachers. I can't stress how valuable it was. I almost consider it more important than graduate school if I would have ever went, because I just had these real life experiences and these great things and these kids I loved. And it was fantastic. So I saw the power of getting an emotional reaction when you could capture, children being children rather than children kind of goofing off for the camera. That's one thing, and I've taken plenty of those as well, because when the kids realize they're being photographed, then they kind of goof off. But these are the ones that really, really resonated with me and the folks, and they love them. So let's talk a little bit about more fine art photography when I really got into this. So into the 2000s, with my interest in shooting abstract imagery, I began to build a significant portfolio from both my professional work and travel. So this is, I would say I started making a little bit of money at photography because people are like, oh, will you come shoot my wedding? Will you come and, you know, shoot my family photos or this and that? So I was like, hey, this is great. They give me $300 to come take a few pictures of their family. This is pretty awesome. You know, this is kind of fun. And then somebody asked me to take a picture of something else. But what I started doing was I realized I was starting to develop a proper portfolio. So these would eventually go on to inform my fine art. And I know Bob did say he wanted me to mention a little bit about fine art, so I'm going to burn through a couple of these images here. But so this is another place out in Little Finland. So when I talk about abstracting nature, on the right, this is a place called Little Finland, is where I think it's called Gold Butte Monument in Nevada. So you can't access it unless you have a four-wheel drive and a GPS. It's pretty far out there. So I got into really trying to shoot interesting photos where I was removing the atmosphere in essence. So these are all just backlit natural light. The yellow is from some lens flare. But when you have to expose to such a degree when it's in shadow, it just removes the sky from the equation and forces you into the abstract aspect of the imagery. So it's not your typical landscape where you'd want to get perfect light or, you know, I'm like, I want to find the worst light possible because I don't want a sky in these because I'm trying to build a body of work here that's really just zeroes in on the abstraction. The image on the left is a strange juxtaposition because when I talked about just having a natural curiosity or a photographic mind, I took a trip to New York for a gallery, art gallery, for an artist I was shooting some work for. So some of these images jump around the timeline, but I thought they'd be interesting to juxtapose. But I went to the Museum of Natural History and I was really enjoying myself. It was a great museum. And has anyone been to the Museum of Natural History in New York? So you know the room with the giant whale, like the big blue whale? So there's a whole ring around it with sort of dioramas of hunters and, you know, animal scenes and taxidermy animals. But there was a pearl diver section that was showing Japanese traditional pearl diving. And I was walking around interesting, and of course in my mind I don't just look at the subject. I took in every detail of everything that I'm doing, and I noticed up on the ceiling of this thing to generate the reflective image, they had sheets of reflective stainless steel that were reflecting with the imagery that was coming up from the bottom with the blue lights to suggest that and some of the rocks and coral formations. And I must have spent an hour kneeling on the floor with a telephoto lens shooting abstract images in the ceiling of this exhibit. And I thought that might have looked pretty silly, but the results I got were incredible. And in my mind, I kept thinking I was anticipating where these things might wind up, not just in and of themselves. So this thing I said about looking at every image I shoot or every image you shoot as something, how does this inform the next piece of work? You know, where's the next step beyond this? And sometimes you'll find out later. So eventually I started making a lot of artwork out of my own photographs. So those turned into things such as this, where I was making hybrid landscapes, where I was taking that abstracted water, creating water, and building my own rock formations and sort of just making my own abstract landscapes. And because I had that ease of not having a sky behind the rock formations, they sort of all created a neutral sky when I started piecing them all together. And this was just sort of an interesting way to design with nature, with my own work. Over the years, I would say this maybe 15 years later, so I'm jumping way far ahead, my work got really kind of outrageous and complicated because I started developing more personal themes. So you can kind of see the rocks in there, still the water formations. These are very complex, totally different lecture, but I just wanted you to see how my photography has wound up in my work. And then over the top, we're getting into some very different territory here, but you can still see those elements of those things years later, how they still come through and how I build my landscapes around this type of work. I shot a lot for natural history museums, like I said. These are the bottom image is an image from the Museum of Natural History from the University of Utah, which I did a lot of work for. And you can kind of see up above where these, I don't really know how to move this thing around. Oh, so once you push it, you can move it. I see, let me see. Okay, there we go. I can't get it. Anyways, if you look to the left of that top image, these are more black and white ones I did, which give me a lot of design freedom to do things, but you can kind of see how I incorporate bones into the landscapes or how I use. But even when I go in a museum and I do work, I'm trying to find the most dramatic image. So luckily, because of the creative approach I've had to things, people like to pay me to make beautiful images of their museum rather than informational images of their museum, and they come back in my work. So there's a really interesting cycle of how these things go, even when I'm doing professional things. So that's from the LA History Natural Museum, and you can see that spinal cord right in the foreground of that piece on top. So I love to sort of see where all the potential of anything I go, no matter what I'm doing. I've done a lot of industrial, I've done a lot of aerospace, I've done a lot of heavy machinery things that have wound up in my work, but it's just a way that I think creatively with these types of things. This was a shoot in Denver I did of a mural in the arts district, and I was working on a piece of art where I said, I really need, there's a heavy theme of mortality running through my work. Again, long story. But I saw this mural because I love photographing and staging work crews. When I do work for a utility crew, I love staging them in front of murals. So, I go looking for, I spend a day location scouting for murals when I'm working in a city to photograph things. I'm like, oh, you know what? I need a giant floating skull in the sky on one of my pieces of work. So I took it home, flipped it in Photoshop, took the opacity down. My work is very landscape based. You can see the progress on the left. I create a landscape. And then I put her in the landscape because I wanted it to be this sort of mystical cloud in the sky looking down on things. And then it turns into the finished piece of work where she's up there doing, looking into her thing. So very complex, but very nature-based again. And this is a good way to explain how all my stuff kind of merges together. So those are kind of strange, I know. Anyway, so somehow I came up with 13 bullet points here. Whether or not we get to all of them tonight, I think it'd be kind of fun to go through these things. But when in developing creativity, I think it's first and foremost important to just make art for yourself. In teaching art and photography and just talking to people, I've noticed a lot of people don't even take the first step because they're already judging themselves against the thing that inspired them to want to be creative in the first place. And that's a huge block because it's a lot easier to not do things than it is to do things, in this world. But when people are already intimidated by what they're inspired by, I've noticed that's a pattern. I've found that in teaching music, I've found that in teaching art, I've found that in teaching photography, that people have a hesitancy to even just start going for it. So, because they're already picturing it being for somebody else other than themselves. Art or photography or anything is something you can develop in private. Nobody has to look at what you're doing, but to not do it, but to think that everything you do is going to be judged or whatever, it's a huge block to creativity. Like I said, start developing a photographic mind, even without a camera is a great thing. Pay attention to your available light in every situation. It's funny, years ago, before I even built a website, I always thought I'd wanted to call, I think my website is Available Light 1. So probably just because I'm a very lazy photographer, maybe I don't want to drag lights around with me wherever I go. So I really learned to work with available as much as I can. This is sort of an interesting thing I threw in number 4 here. Your phone is invaluable. And I realize we all want to use our pro equipment and whatnot, but when I said if you're at the gas station and you see perfect morning light and some interesting shadows, you don't have to show it to anybody. You don't have to get an Instagram account. You don't have to post it on social media. But if you frame it and you take the picture and you play around with it with the editing capabilities of our modern phones these days, then you've basically given yourself a little lesson. You've almost cemented something that you've observed. And that's just through direct perceptual engagement of everything that we do. And when I got on Instagram, I saw it more as a journal for my own perceptual engagement. I'm going to re-stress that phrase. I never used it as a marketing tool. I still haven't. It's just something that if I see something beautiful, I photograph it. If I see something interesting, I photograph it. And whether or not I post it or not, there's plenty I don't. But every single time I do that, it's a lesson and it's an affirmation that I'm looking at the world critically and creatively. So I would say don't ever underestimate the power of your phone to just teach you a quick lesson no matter where you're at. And I would teach that to my students all the time. I said, you're getting coffee in the morning and you're sitting next to a window and your friend is sitting in perfect Vermeer lighting and the background is perfect. Take a picture of them. Just put a second thought, because sometimes I think people take a cell phone, they're like, oh, it's a crappy picture because it's a crappy phone. I think if you look at it more as a tool that you can reference it for content and composition, nothing more, You basically can be spontaneous. You can interact with the world immediately on the spot, being in the moment. Very much is a huge thing about photography, because it's just a moment you're capturing. But the phone is a powerful tool. Learn to look at the world in black and white. Sometimes color isn't everything. Sometimes color can distract. Sometimes color can ruin an image if there's too much of one color in one place and not enough in another. So it's good to just always make a black and white copy of your work, just to see how it feels, just to see if it feels different, how it looks different. I always looked at digital photography as a disposable medium. That sounds like a little bit of a negative term, but the fact that it's disposable means that it's not costing you, like in the olden times when I would develop. I think the last weddings I shot in film in the early 2000s, before I went digital, I think the processing cost was almost $2,000 for it, and I think I shot maybe 20 rolls of film. And it was before I really learned the business of doing wedding photography, and I think I charged her $1,700 for the wedding, not realizing what this. So I think I was out of pocket $300 for one of the biggest nightmare scenarios of my entire life, and the stress of not knowing what I was shooting because I was shooting film. Lesson learned. So I got a digital camera soon after that. But yeah, I did a lot of advertising and everything in film before I started getting into digital. But then I realized, wow, this is great. And you know, some people live by the motto of spray and pray. Have you guys ever heard that term? Just shoot 1,000 photos, and it's a little bit. I think that's a little bit loosey-goosey for me. I think you know, if you're thinking critically, take 10 photos. You know, take 10 portraits of that person, because what you start to learn in the editing process, and this is a big thing I would emphasize, because students I'd see them take. Well, the way I taught photography for fine artists for 7 years at Laguna College of Art and Design. And so I would just get a model and say, all right, where do you guys want to go today? Let's go find a spot in nature. Let's go look at downtown. Let's go look at architecture. Let's go do architectural abstractions. Let's go here. Let's go figure it out. Let's just find the best possible picture and throw a model in this situation. But I noticed people would take a picture and go, oh, this picture stinks. And they would just kind of walk away from it saying, why aren't you taking 20 pictures? Well, why do I need to take 20 pictures? And I said, well, when you get them in the editing bay, you'll find out, because you'll learn that people go through a variety of micro expressions. You know, it's not just somebody blinking that makes a bad picture. Sometimes it's just a subtle head turn that changes the shadow on their face. So you take 10 photos and learn to know what resonates when you're looking through those. Which is the one, when you say, oh, that's the one, just learn to recognize that feeling in everything that you do. And that comes to doing it even without the camera. It's like, oh, that's it. There's that moment that I think you develop and start to recognize, but I think you can do that. I think you learn quality through quantity. And I think that's what digital is really a great tool to do. Let's see, give yourself permission to think outside the box, just experiment. There's no consequences with making art. I say waking up your peripheral vision, and that's why I say find the best photo. Don't just be myopically focused on your subject, kind of what's going on, what's happening behind me. And I'll get into some examples here. We do get into more photos here. You know, prioritize your background over your subject. You know, that's another huge thing. I think people, again, get so focused on a subject, they don't realize there's a telephone pole sticking out of the head. I think that's the most simple example, or there's a garbage can next to them, or anything else. You know, if you are saying, what is the best photo without this person, and then you put a person in that photo, it's going to just deepen the effect of the photo has on the viewer of that photo. So, you know, you're constantly scanning, and again, that's something where you can wake those skills up, even if you're not with a camera, as long as you're just switching to a different mindset when you walk outside the door in the morning. You know, are your photos informational, or are you telling a story? You know, there's something to look at that. You know, if you're taking a beautiful, you know, I think I said to Manny, I said, hey, you know, when you go out to shoot wildlife and you're walking out to the spot, or if you're wherever you're at, you know, you may be thinking wildlife, 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 but while the light, you may be able to take the most beautiful portrait you've ever taken of your friend next to you, but you're not paying attention to that. So what's happening? How are you telling the story? How beautiful is the walk out to where you're staging your shots? You know, just think beyond your subject is a way to look at that. Creative cropping. I always go find more pictures within the pictures. I tend to try to, every time I shoot a picture, I tend to try to crop out any non-essential information when I do that kind of stuff. You'll see a lot of panoramic sort of formed images, because I think, well, I don't need 3 inches of sky and negative space to make this point, so it kind of concentrates your information. And you know, try new lenses, try new equipment, rent equipment. It's so easy these days. I don't know how many of you work with prime lenses, but a great lens to start with, if you want to do it, that's pretty inexpensive, is a 50 millimeter prime, because it frames your perspective in reality as the naked eye sees it. So you don't get to zoom out and get all this information. So if someone's standing here and I'm taking a picture of these fine folks in the front row, there's a person here that's blurry, but they're composing, and you're composing somebody in the abstract in essence, because this is exactly how you see it in reality. And I think that was another huge lesson I learned when I took my initial first Photoshop classes in the mid-90s, I think, or maybe probably mid-90s when I was in school. And they wanted us to learn how to generate all these images in the computer. And I'm like, why don't we just try to take more interesting pictures that would facilitate copy? You know what I mean? So I started shooting pictures. I started putting, like, directly trying to shoot with shallow depths of fields with this 50mm lens so I could abstract out the background, because, oh, here's where I would put the copy because there's not a lot of detail to compete with it. Or let me photograph this portrait of a person through a window so there's an interesting reflection that is doing something else. I basically learned how to be an abstract expressionist through the camera while I was photographing representational subjects as people. So like I said, maybe it's because I was lazy. I didn't want to do Photoshop, but anyways, it kind of worked out for me in the long run. So anyways, now that we've gone through these, we'll kind of look at some more pictures here. So when I say look at the world in the abstract, this was an interesting image. I did find it. Remember I was telling you about that, Bob? This image with the waterfall and the train. So these are two photos from the same location. This is Snoqualmie Falls in North Bend, Washington, and the adjacent train museum and yard. So I took them in the same visit, but this is, again, just walking around. But I remember, like, you know, there's the waterfall, and everyone takes a picture of the waterfall. There's the famous hotel. And there it is. But I'm like, you know, it's really interesting, because I noticed with the patterns that the waterfall was making on the edge where the water was breaking up and falling, and I noticed there was this really huge area of negative space. I go, well, I'm going to try to do this more dramatically. I'm not going to make this about the iconic waterfall. I'm going to do this in the abstract. And I was walking around the train yard. There's this beautiful, menacing rotary snowplow that they had restored and painted jet black. It was absolutely fantastic. And I noticed that it had this sense of drama, but this sunlight was hitting on the right. And I remember I shot this picture, and in my mind, I hadn't thought that I'd shot the same picture, but when I think this was on film as well, so when I developed the roll of film, I noticed that I'm like, oh, did I shoot two of that? And no, I didn't. My brain just sort of remembered, and I remember shooting these pictures in the abstract. So this is what I mean by photographing in the abstract. It's just sort of seeing the world this way. So more your subject matter, it just becomes, like, kind of everything becomes more, I guess, I don't want to say the same, but when you kind of look at things, when you're squinting, you tend to see things, you tend to see different things. You tend to see more of the relationships in the abstract. So I think that was a good example. I have a lot of these. Here's another one. So let's go one in nature and let's go one in studio. So you can kind of see they're almost essentially the exact same photograph. And these are all pictures I took in demos for my college course too. So, but again, my understanding of nature, I knew where to put this person to bring her out against the background. And what's funny about the photograph on the left is I decided to leave that little sliver of information that was the strobe light in the studio just to kind of bring it back into reality. But what's fun about working with the strobe is if you leave your shutter just a little bit longer and kind of wiggle that camera around after you freeze that image, you just get these unbelievably beautiful movement images that really start to abstract things. So it's beautiful. You can do that in nature, not as much because the strobe is it really freezes things, and then you can kind of be free to move around. But this is another way that I sort of view things in a similar fashion, whether I'm in the studio or whether I'm outdoors working with a model, with a class, or myself. I don't really shoot a lot of model photography unless I just consider the portraits I get to shoot for friends and family my models. So I'm not really somebody who hires models, but these were for my class. And this is another sort of example of always looking at things in black and white. This was from the same shoot, but completely random. I never know what I'm going to get when I shoot these kind of things, but because of digital photography, I can have 100, that are just a big mess, and then I can have one that is just, almost just transcendental in its beauty that I had no idea was going to happen. And I think that's one of those fun things where you just get surprised, and these things just inform you. They continue to inform you. You can see the black and white has a very different feel to it. But, it's always good. Just make a copy and turn it into black and white and see what you start to learn from your own photography. You can be your own best teacher because you're asking yourself, why does this image work and why doesn't this image work? This is from the same session with this, but I love putting people in relationship to nature. This is not just about the model. This is about how I can make this image overall in the abstract work and make it even more beautiful than you can just by taking a picture of a model. And again, these are with this is with the 50 millimeter as well. So you can see how nice and soft that background comes out, because, you know, a bunch of craggy, hard, barnacle encrusted rocks are going to distract from that portrait. And then just cropping it in a creative way. So these are other examples of portraits I've done where I just needed, this was right on the curb at the plaza down on Newport Coast. Just happened to shoot this person right there. You know, people walking by, cars in the background, but again, and to go back to our friend who did the lighting demo, this is 100% backlit light, but I'm overexposing to the extreme, because what I know is that when you overexpose, you're going to erase what's happening in the background where the light source is. So I want to have that neutral thing. I want to create space around the subject. I want to frame her in something beautiful in nature. Then you can do it. And that was just when I pulled back. This was a store that just wanted me to do some fashion photography for a day for them. You know, whenever you can do it, give somebody a halo or an arch to work with above their head. You know, that's always nice to do. All of a sudden gives them almost a religiosity about them, you know, something like that, but it's quite elegant. More aspects of portraiture in nature, you know, just using available light. When the spring comes and these beautiful mustard blossoms happen and the wind happens, just go out there and take 100 pictures of somebody with their hair blowing in the wind, and you can just get these really beautiful, almost Andrew Wyeth looking portraits. And again, fine art has very much informed my photography in life. This is another one. Again, I'm sort of using that tree as my guide to sort of, even for body gesture, I just like the way nature moves, and I like the way people interact with nature. Again, this is backlit completely. I'm a big fan of backlighting photography for portraits, because you aren't going to get any crazy shadows on the face. You can just work with your exposure in Lightroom or Photoshop or however you do it, or just within camera. I mean, everything you see is probably about 90% just in the shot, not a lot of Photoshop. Again, you know, a dynamic with a portrait, but you can kind of tell I'm obsessed with landscape before my subject. So anyways, but it works out. Here's some more examples of things that happen just working with shadows, you know, a little bit deeper on portraits. The top one was a French horn player that I was taking he wanted some headshots and whatnot, and we happened to be walking about, and he was feeding some birds. I'm like, hey, you know, stand back a little bit and let me stop down and freeze the action of these birds. And all of a sudden I have a bird levitating in front of his head. Another guitar player I was working with thought the shadow was a little more mysterious off the guitar, you know, in another area in nature. Some sort of family portraits, a little bit of storytelling going on here with the sun. You know, so I always try to put people in the most beautiful situations I can. So, you know, I went out to do family photography for this thing, and this is the one they wound up framing and putting on their wall, not the ones of just themselves, like, because we all know what we look like in the mirror every morning. And that's great. Of course, you know, they get plenty of that. They're like, oh my God, this just sums it up so much. And you know, what is that? What is the power of a beautiful image where you just contextualize somebody, you know, in nature, and you know, a setting sun. I mean, you can find all kinds of narrative potential in this type of imagery. So we're taking another jump here. I'll talk a little bit about my career. It's sort of a strange one. I've worked in the fine arts, museum photography, galleries, artists. I do a ton of industrial photography, architectural photography. And if landscape has informed everything, like I said, has certainly informed what I just call geometric landscapes in architecture in nature. So I always like to kind of think about how things have inspired me and what I try to achieve when I'm doing some of these. These were some distribution warehouses out in Moreno Valley that I did, but all I did was scout the weather and just wait for the right clouds and just try to look at it as a landscape rather than just a big old boring building. So, you know, you can see how this kind of works. You know, you can take beautiful pictures of buildings if you just are patient enough and kind of work with it. And, you know, what really gets fun, just like I did with nature, I've learned, and my clients absolutely love this when I do this for them, because they're like, I never saw that. I started looking at the details in the architecture. You know, what are the most beautiful things happening? How is the light reflecting? Where is the sun hitting? Like what, you know, I time things for certain times of day because I know windows will be reflecting this color of skylight or this morning sun or these clouds. And it just creates interesting drama. It creates interesting things, and it really flatters the architects. You know, if the building is really nicely enough designed, then it makes me want to really break it apart. So this is commercial art. Is what I do, but I've been so lucky to be able to be creative in these fields. You know, here's some more interesting things. Just observing. You know, anywhere I can find a reflection of a sunlight that can come in, I look at that as a plus, especially if it doesn't become overbearing. But you know, and I would tell my students, I said, you know, if you can do that, if you find reflections, always see how you can look at reflections and see how light is bouncing back, because it's a really great way to sort of fake some studio lighting at certain times. I've used bounce off of skyscrapers that come back into another building to create really almost mystical effects with reflected light and portraiture. And sometimes I say it really brings, if you think of light as more, not in a literal sense, as more of like, what does light represent, you know? I almost like to say, if you can create light coming from your subject, then it has a different emotional impact, even if it's something as benign as architecture. So if I can pull the sun literally into my photograph, that's always a fun thing to do. It's a great thing to do with live music too. Like, I could have done this whole talk on live music, but I always shoot for the lights. You know, like what are the lights doing? It's interesting in this environment. So this is something else that I love to do. There's another one. This is completely lit by reflected light from an opposite building, because you can see the sun over there. But all these strange reflections were coming back into it, even though that was a backlit subject. And sometimes I find just the abstract potential of these. You know, there's another thinking more like a landscape than I am about a building. More details where I just find these interesting opportunities to compose, I mean, purely abstract imagery. I mean, if you kind of, like I said, squint at that thing and you take the information out of it, it just becomes shapes and lines and leading lines and shadows and whatnot. But I find that these people really enjoy these. They're shooting through glass into this fixture because the reflection was equally as beautiful. There were sycamore trees in the background, but that's something that really you can develop some interesting skills if you start paying very close attention to reflections and what you're seeing in them. That's a fun thing to do. These are the crews that build a lot of these things. So I go out and photograph work crews, and I'll tell you, photographing guys in neon highlighter outfits is a very much a challenge. And I have a little run of photos here that I'm going to get into, but this is the construction of some of this area, and you know, even trying to make these, even sort of making these sort of behind the scenes of these experiences are kind of interesting. You know, it's always something to think about what's going on. It's not just about the monument or the fixture they're putting in. It's about the process of putting it in. And with our guest photographer, who was our featured photographer? Where is she at? When you told me you guys were broken down or trying to get out of the snow, I'm saying, oh, I want to see what that looked like. Like, it was my curiosity to see. Next time, take a picture of you guys digging yourself out of the snow and then put it in context with the story. I'm like, oh, do you got a picture of that? I want to see what that was like. You guys. Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah, and that could be a nice black and white image, but I'm like, oh, I want to see some pictures of you guys digging it out, because sometimes that's the story. You know, you come back from a terrible trip or you have a great trip, but there's these calamities that happen. Sometimes they could become the best part of the story. So, you know, I love telling stories around this and finding dramatic light for these things, and it's great. And, you know, sometimes if I'm doing buildings or these interesting areas, I find almost like these Stonehenge moments, like, oh, wow, there's a sort of a celestial event happening here between these monuments going on, you know, like one time a year, that sun's going to go right between these buildings. You know, it's like, but I'm always thinking of something else that may have inspired me to take that shot. You know, it's like the photograph was supposed to be the 535 Met sign, which the company I work for builds, is these architectural branding things. But I'm like, wow, there's a solar event happening right here at this time of day. And I'll leave the lens flare because it's just kind of mysterious, you know, so you know, you can be really creative doing commercial work. It's interesting, and then I'm sometimes paid to take beautiful pictures of parking lots that they have to present to. This was meant to be presented to city council to show that it was not emitting a bunch of light. And I'm like, well, I might as well make that beautiful while I'm at it. So, you know, I had to do it at night because the city council was saying, no, we don't want that there because it's going to be too much light on the freeway for some reason. So he's like, can you get a picture of this thing to show that it's not like going to be a terrible light source? I said, yeah, I can do that. So I went and I camped out right on the MacArthur on the 405. I walked down in the bushes and I posted up with my tripod and I waited for the right twilight to where that indigo is in the background and created a nighttime photograph. But it's fun. And again, back to nature and monuments, you know, if we're abstracting everything, it all just kind of looks the same in the abstract. So it's like, I don't know which one informed what first. I think I don't know what order those came in, but yeah, if you look, my mind is sort of always thinking of how, you know, I mean, how many people have driven past that Marina Park sign and not taken a beautiful picture of it. I don't know. But it's like they're missing out if they didn't at least see it, because it's like, oh, hey, it looks like that time I was in Joshua Tree. And that's another thing too, when I said to sort of consider everything around you. So I deliberately I call these reverse sunsets, because this is looking away from the sunset. So the view behind me where the actual sunset was, where I maybe should have been photographing, you miss out on those pinks and purples that happen in the evening, and the sunset was more kind of blown out. There wasn't really a dramatic feature. And this is an interesting feature that I've rock climbed several times with some of my best friends, and I have some sentimental attachment to Joshua Tree for those reasons. And like, I'm going to put that rock completely in shadow and ambient light, and just wait till those purples just go haywire, because I sort of anticipated what was going to happen because of, like I said, just sort of my memory bank, knowing what the light does in Joshua Tree. So I'm like, I'm going to go get that in the shadow around 7 o'clock and see what happens. But same principle applies when I go to photograph monuments for parking lots. I don't look at one subject as more important than the other subject. You know what I mean? So that's kind of the way I look at that stuff. This is going to be a quick dive. So if you ever need to take a portrait of an engineer, and you want to make it a nice picture, just put them next to a single source light window, and you go back to Vermeer lighting. The famous painter from the Netherlands, and I think we got a little bit of Rembrandt lighting in there, correct, too, if I can do that. So same thing, but these are not by accident, but you can take a picture of somebody at a computer and it can be a beautiful picture. There's no reason it shouldn't be a beautiful picture. It's telling a story. I'm trying to put some aesthetics into it and whatnot. So this is an interesting company, and when I talked about the highlighter men, the neon highlighter men, this is like a day in the life of that. We usually start with a team meeting in the morning with our engineers and what they want to get shot. And then we just go out to the parking lot, start loading up the trucks. This is a crew that does road closures, utility support, everything else. But it's a fantastic company I worked for a lot of years. And they've just said, dude, just do what you do. Let's just go out and do it. And hey, let's get a shot of a guy like stomping in the water here with your logo. So I'm always thinking logo. This is absolutely as commercial as work gets, but there's no reason it can't be creative work. So I had him take a couple passes and just kind of got down on the ground low with them, and I got a nice City Rise logo. So this was up in the Bay Area in San Francisco. So I spent an entire first day location scouting all over the Bay Area, up into Marin County, from Oakland, everywhere else. And I thought I'd just do a little storytelling about how these things work and how you can sort of bring something that is just industrial and seems really unglamorous and try to elevate the subject is what I'm paid to do in these situations. But for me, I'm just having a great time, because I'm just trying to take the best picture I can take. I'm indifferent to the subject, sort of, but I'm like, what is the most interesting photo I can take here? So if it's through the windshield with the Oakland Bay Bridge in the background and the San Francisco skyline and a team looking at the plans for what they need to do for the day, then that's the interesting picture. But I call them the highlighter brigade, because neon orange is it's not a flattering color, but boy, I'll tell you what, it's not easy to work with. So, but we get these interesting shots, the dynamics of just the interactions, even though they're simple. But I'm trying to tell a story here that, this crew, this is where they work. And these are all very meticulously, I wouldn't say staged so much, but the locations are very prominent. So if that doesn't say, if that says San Francisco to me, because you got a Charlie in the background dividing these guys, I think this is my 50 again. I call it my nifty 50, because I can always blur out that background. Again, some action in downtown there. From inside the truck, we have Ghirardelli Square. But, basically what my job was to say, hey, show us that we are the premier, utility services and traffic control in the Bay Area. So what do? I find the most iconic images in the Bay Area. I've done this in Washington, D.C. I've done it in Philadelphia. I've done it all over Colorado, all over California, Baltimore, the East Coast for this company. And it's like, hey, go out and find the most beautiful monuments you can find in the city and throw our people in front of it and see what you do. So it's like, I can't have more fun doing this stuff, but it's a great time. This is up in the Marin Headlands. They always say, hey, if we can get a hero shot, that'd be great. And I'm saying, I know exactly where we need to get the hero shot. And let's just hope that the weather cooperates for us. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to be up for a few days, but these are very difficult shots to coordinate. And you got to be a little tenacious. I think I scrambled up a hill here that was somewhat precarious. And this is all before the Rangers, because I didn't realize we weren't allowed to be doing this. Because what's really fun about working with these guys is they can go anywhere. I said, don't worry, we'll throw an arrow board up. Nobody's going to say anything to us. So we did this. Totally illegal. Sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission. And we got the hero shot with the logos and the Babe and the Golden Gate Bridge. And this is just driving down the back side of that. So this is what's going on behind me. And, you know, and hey, I just happened to see an interesting photograph of San Francisco and decided to crop it out. You know, so more of the work I do is just very industrial, skilled trade, medical technology. But I've been lucky enough to get into the process of making some of these unbelievably complex and beautiful objects. I do photograph art for a living, so when I get into more industrial aspects of things, I like to see the process, and people like to have me photograph the process, and it really brings it around. So, you know, even just stacking them up can be a beautiful picture. You know, how they file these things in their shelves. But you know, that's the final shot up on the left of what they wanted, as far as like making these sort of, you know, more fine art images of their product, less informational, because they wanted to do work for their website. So I like to tell a story around these things, and it's really fun. You know, this is I got a dog photo in there. I had to have one pet, right? Everybody likes dogs. This is a guy that builds these really interesting metal instruments up in out in Aurora, Colorado, that I bought from him in the past. But I actually got to meet the guy when I was out on an aerospace shoot in Colorado. I said, "Hey, you mind if I come by and take a look at your shop and get some pictures and tell a story for him?" And you know, again, just every aspect of it is fun. And you know, just thinking about shadows and how things work. I love that picture on the bottom where he's holding it, but I put him in the shadow of the garage and brought the piece out that he's making, which is an interesting percussion instrument. You're probably wondering what that thing is, but so I got every aspect of that process, which is a good time. So these are more like light experiments, like similar to that one that we did. I think I got a few more minutes. So I think we're going to pull this off. So, so these are examples of images that are the result of hundreds, and this is where I talked about not being afraid to fail and experiment. Hundreds of photos to do this for these musicians that I've shot for. And I think when you really experiment with exposure, time, and everything, whether or not you throw out 90% of your images, you're really teaching yourself something. And some of the discoveries are just amazing. I mean, they're so beautiful to me when I get these images. So these were, I gave a few examples of these. These were single strobe light, just a zoom lens, so I could get sort of that motion when you get the flash. And sometimes I would trigger the flash for a second shot, would get that way. But it's a way, if you're working in a really sort of flat environment, to make something seem extremely dynamic. So these are really beautiful things. This is basically standing within the same picture plane. These are 3 different pictures that I got out of this from literally the same view. So it's a beautiful Art Deco building that I'm inside of. And you can see the windows up there for the black and white shot, because that wasn't really one I didn't think color really suited it. The next one was one I hit him with that flash and left the shutter open for maybe a second. But all of a sudden, just the ambient light coming from underneath the door and from a couple of these banners that were hanging in the background, because sometimes I'll take the picture and I'll just move the camera around the room. So I might take a portrait and just go, this is interesting up here, this light. So all of a sudden, there's a mystical orange thing happening. Or if there's an interesting light source, it does these script-like designs, you know, going back to that abstract art we were looking at. But that big white section up there was what those windows turned into. But this is how dynamic this is the dynamic range you can get. This is from the same picture plane. I think he just changed his outfit for one or took his jacket off, but I just wanted to use that as my source and then see what happened. And this is kind of the results we get. There's a couple more. So this was one, again, in front of a backdrop, sort of a canvas backdrop that I triggered the strobe 4 times and had him basically walk through the picture so he wouldn't be on top of himself. But you know, this was for an album he was doing of experimental ambient music, and we wanted to do something really mysterious. And I'm like, hey, there you go. So this is not photoshopped. This is just one frame in the camera, but I just triggered my strobe light 4 times and probably just kicked the contrast up a little bit, and that was about it. So there's not really, I guess it's, you know, like I said, I'm lazy. I don't like doing a lot of Photoshop work if I don't have to. So I just figured out a way to do it in the camera just to save myself some time and trouble. So, and you can see, and I think this is probably the last image, and another fun thing because it's a time sequence thing. And again, to say, hey, you know, there's a lot going on in front of us that are very similar, and I thought we'd kind of end with a little party image. So not much difference between a wedding celebration in a mosh pit at a hardcore metal concert, if you look at what's going on here. So, you know, again, let's look at the world a little more abstractly and see what happens. You know what I mean? So it's just, it makes my life so much more enjoyable to go anywhere I go and say, hey, I'm just going to apply all of my creative knowledge that I've absorbed over all the years and see what happens. Sometimes it's just fun to surprise yourself when you go out there in the world, rather than thinking, this is the picture I'm going to get, this is where I'm going to get it, this is exactly how it's going to look. Just forget about the outcome, because you sometimes, you know, unless that's something you have to do. But I don't know. I just think by opening up all of my perceptual faculties, it's enriched my life beyond what my imagination could have ever been. It's fun to talk about this. Like I said, I've never given a talk about my creativity in general. I've mostly just taught and just kind of done these things on my own. I don't even think I've ever had a photography exhibit. I don't think I've ever, maybe I've had a picture somewhere. I don't know. But yeah, just kind of a weird outsider in that sense, because I do my work and people pay me for it, and then I just never see it again. So when I went through my hard drives, like I was telling, I think I talked to Manny a couple of times. I said, I'm sorry, when I talked to Bob a couple of times, I said, I'm overwhelmed. I'm like, in the best possible way. I said, it's hard to believe. I must have 1 million photographs from over my life, that I've done, and just looking, I think I just went maybe 10 years back in my hard drives, because I kind of put out that sort of guidelines I wanted to do. You know, I think I put them in, that's where they were, but and I wanted to go just find images that inspired me to talk about the story and the conversation around them. And this is what I came up with. Like I said, these span probably 30 years, some of the images I've pulled out for this. And like I said, every one of them, I guess I'm blessed or cursed with that photographic memory, because I started reliving the experience, because I have that kind of memory where it's like I know exactly what was going on. I remember the smells, I remember the sights, I remember the sounds of everything I ever did, of every picture I've ever taken. And you know, so this was a real fun thing to put together for you guys. And I wish I had a semester to work with you all to do it, because it might be a little easier than me just like speed talking through it. But I hope this inspired a little bit of creativity. Maybe, I don't know. Did it land? I have no idea. But I appreciate you guys listening to me for a little bit. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments or hecklers. Come on, where are you? I tend to respond well to heckling. I've noticed that, being a teacher. So I don't know, but I really appreciate you guys sitting here for me and looking at my work and whatnot. Yes, sir.
Question concerning photography and fine art.
Yes.
What makes a photograph fine art?
That's totally subjective. I don't know what makes a picture fine art. It's almost if somebody puts it on a wall and calls it fine art. I guess you could say that, because I've certainly seen fine art photography that in my opinion, I don't think is fine art photography. You know, we could default to like Ansel Adams, or, you know, any famous photographer. You know, I think some of those beautiful fine art photography is stuff, I don't know. I mean, you could look at Pulitzer Prize photos that were completely randomly taken and considered a fine art photograph. You know, I could have done a whole talk on photographers I love. I'm a huge fan of, does anybody know who Vivian Maier is? Has anyone heard of that name? They found her stuff in a locker she had never even exhibited once in her life. I can kind of relate to that, but you know, some of those images are some of those stunning images of just reality in everyday life I've ever seen. You know, and then there's people that go to the trouble of going and, you know, taking these beautiful portraits, and then it's almost like I guess it could be fine art if you frame it and put it on a wall. You can call it that. You know, I don't know that there's an objective standard for that, to be honest. You know, I've done so much industrial work in architecture, and some of them I consider maybe the most beautiful work I've ever done, but would an art gallery hang a picture that I shot on one of my industrial shoots, or, you know, the work I put into photographing an extremely complex part of a satellite that I decided to make really beautiful, you know, background, perfect lighting. Technically, that may be more of a fine art photograph than something that I just fell into. So I think it really is, it's completely subjective. It's hard to call. I don't know if does that help answer maybe it doesn't answer the question. Yeah, you know when you see it. You'll know when it happens. When someone says, hey, can we hang that in my gallery? You're like, this must be fine art. So, yeah, you're welcome. Yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, you're very welcome. I enjoyed it too. No, I'm not. I actually taught for 7 years that course, and I would say sadly, I stepped down respectfully and gratefully, luckily, right at the beginning of 2020. So if I would have had to teach online, I might have just ended up saying, good luck, everybody, I'm out. Because the way I teach, I don't know that I could have pulled it off. And I know so many teachers that went through just that nightmare. I've taught privately in the past. I've done a lot of, I've done a couple workshops here and there, but mostly it's been people I've given, like I will do portraits for a family or something. I'll get that and they'll say, oh my God, these pictures are beautiful. And do you teach photography? Yeah, sure. I'll hang out with you a few times and do it. No problem. You know, and I'm always happy to share that with people. So yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Recently, I feel I was primed for this because I gave a 2-day workshop and a lecture for LCAT, because I do teach that at Laguna College in Design if the enrollment goes, but you know, art schools are kind of going through some strange things right now, so enrollment's a question, but I believe that I'm teaching it again at Laguna, the collage work, which is, like I said, a whole different lecture. I'm teaching that in the spring, and if it goes well, then I'll probably be teaching it in the fall as well. But yeah, but I don't know, I was thinking about talking to your, I love teaching collage. I love teaching collage. There's something, talk about creative pathways opening and neural pathways that you had no idea. The fellow that was in here about the art school, I was like, maybe I should do a community course, you know, because it's art for the people. I mean, collage and photography are so accessible, and that's what I love. I hate the idea of these elite art institutions. It drives me crazy, because I'm more inclined to folk art, outsider art. You know, people that are doing it for the love of doing it. And I think these mediums like photography and collage are available to everybody. You're automatically on the same level. Like once you grasp the concept of what you're doing and the content is sort of done for you, it's just all about imagination and design. And there's no wrong answers, because, you know, hey, I want to make a collage of this, or I need a person, but I can't paint people, so I'm not going to make a collage. It's going to take me 10 years of art school or whatever to figure out how to draw a hand or an eye. It's like, no, I'm just going to cut the person out and throw them in the environment. It's paper dolls, essentially, is what it is. You know what I mean? But it's like, how crazy do you want to make it? You know, I love teaching collage. So I was actually going to take that guy's business card and say, I don't know if you guys would ever want one at a community center, but maybe we'll get back if I teach it. Yeah, because I just love bringing it to just people. It's something I've done forever. You know, I've had friends that I've gotten into that have turned into photographers just by using their cell phone. Like I said, just look at it a little more critically. Just take it a little more seriously. Like take a second look at everything you do. And then the collage thing, it's that permission that people don't really give themselves to just kind of go out on a limb, because there's no consequences to art or creativity if you can just take the judgment out of it or the doubt, you know, and just have fun. Like it's more about having fun. These shoots I do, I'm having the time of my life. You know, I go shoot architecture. I'm walking around alone in these properties. I'm elated because I'm like, oh, I get to really look at this critically, because I've just developed such a way of looking at the world that no matter where I go, I'm interested in doing it. You know, I mean, I you know, doing weddings back in my early day, it's kind of a drag, but what I enjoyed about weddings was the photography and the pressure, because I need to find a way to take the most creative image as fast as I can. But yeah, that's it. So I like the pressure. It's like the fast moving environment of music. So it's a good thing. It keeps me on my toes. But I think we got to get out of here, right? Yeah, we do. Okay. I'm going to get the cane. Oh, one more question. One more. Sorry, yes. One more. Well, let's get one more question. Yes. No, you know, in fact, it's like, even though I shoot digital gear these days, and, you know, even not even the highest, and I use a Canon 6D Mark II. I just do that work, the exposure work in Photoshop or light metering. Yeah, I just tend to think on the fly, and I get a good eye for exposure. I still shoot that thing like my Canon A1 I had in the 80s. A monitor? Oh no, I can't stand looking at anything but through the viewfinder. I like to block every aspect of what I'm seeing except for what I'm looking at through the camera. So I don't usually use a monitor because it distracts me from what I'm looking at for the most part. I just look at it all later. So, but yeah, I don't do a lot of metering on the spot. It just kind of slows me down because I have to think pretty quick with a lot of the stuff I do. But yeah, that's it. But I really appreciate you guys inviting me out, and I hope it was informative. So.
Wow, Eric, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Okay, before you go, 2 quick words.